It's always been the relationships, not the technical side. Although I will say, let me start with the technical side, and this is a fantastic question, that there are now standardized formats that we all know and kind of get used to in terms of ingesting. Like every time we bring a new feed on, it's either an existing PMS, like a real page or a Yardi that we already work with, so someone just switches it on, or it comes in like a standard MITS format or truly a XML format. So they're kind of like these standards in our industry now, some of which we've helped to build, but honestly, most of which, if I'm being candid, we benefited from as a later entrant.
Okay, we're here with Anth, co-founder and CEO of Zumper. Anth, tell us who you are.
Well, David Reed, thank you for having me. I have Greek name, British accent, but I'm now an American, so I'm kind of confusing. So yeah, my name is Anthemos or Anth. I run a company called Zumper that is about to turn 12. We are an online residential rental marketplace, or as most of the industry would call us, an ILS. And as a 12-year-old company, it makes us pretty young still as an ILS. Feels a bit like being a teenager still. But as a startup, being over 10 years old makes us super old. And so in startup land, we're considered quite old now. As an ILS, we're still considered kind of pretty young as a teenager. And yeah, excited to be here today.
Yeah, thanks, Anth.
Real quick, I'm sorry to jump in front, but with two daughters that are 14, maybe I shouldn't have set it up that way. We may need to edit that or this segment. But I was just going to ask, does that mean that you're in puberty or that you're past that point? And as a company, I'm wondering how much at 12 does this line up with actual like maturity stages? So at like 15, 16, 17 years, like when does Zumper become an adult versus like adolescence? And then, yeah, puberty, I guess, would be that awkward stage. But I think you guys are past that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how it feels, as you all know, at Digible, I think like every year in a startup feels like 10 in terms of like the dog years. So I pretty feel like 120. So I feel at this stage incredibly experienced, given all the peaks and troughs of running a startup. I'd say in terms of how we are in the industry, I think we are still seen as the youngest ILS, and we constantly have to kind of explain that. And I think whereas people know who Zumper is, we're still constantly asked, like, why would I use you over X, Y, or Z? But I think that has an advantage, is where the riskiest, we're prepared to use the most modern technologies. And so I think it puts us past puberty, but we're still young and we're still risky. And I think that makes us kind of interesting in our own right.
Totally. Well, appreciate that. Sorry, David, go ahead.
It's interesting because I had never thought of, I didn't think of you guys as being a young ILS, but as you talk through it, you're kind of right there. I'm curious, Anth, you've been in this a little bit longer than Reed and I have. We only got in the industry about a decade ago, and then Digible was just over 7 years. Was there more ILSs trying to get off the ground pre you guys versus post you guys, or what has that been like?
Yeah, there's when we launched in 2012, it was kind of around the same stage that, like, I think a lot of entrepreneurs and big companies saw this opportunity that, Craigslist had been around for decades and no one had built a better real estate portal. So at the same time, then you had like the Zillows and the Trulias of the world launch their rental verticals. Then you had a bunch of startups kind of launch. Like one of the first was PadMapper that we ended up acquiring, and Zumper was a few years after them. Then there was like another half a dozen startups at the same kind of time were funded. A bunch of them raised Series A's and raised quite a lot of money. So actually when we launched, despite the fact that it felt like kind of a unique idea, when I look back, at the same time we launched, there was a bunch of startups who'd launched before us that we got to know later on. And then a bunch of the public companies also launched rental verticals. So actually it was a really competitive time to launch. Since then, I think it's narrowed down. And I think now at scale, in terms of, ILSs that have like millions of monthly unique renters, I think there's now like 4 or 5 companies that do that. And I think Zumper is clearly in that pack, but we are the youngest company who made it. I think from here going forward, these are famous last words, but it's hard to see an ILS coming out of like left field right now, given the structural advantages you have as an ILS who has 10 years of like data ingestion, building real-time unit level availability feeds. It would be quite hard to see something coming out of left field now, but oh boy, was it competitive to get to where we are today.
That's super interesting. So do you actually think it'd be harder now then? Is that what you're saying to launch
I,
versus?
I think so. I think about rentals a lot as, look, Zumper likes to think, we have a really good product, and I think we do, and I think we have good brand recognition with younger renters, which we do. But the unsexy reality about what's probably our biggest differentiator is our back end kind of listing infrastructure. So receiving over 1 million listings a month in real time, keeping them up to date, like hotel sites or flight sites, they have to be updated to the second. And when I think about what's the most defensible thing about an ILS, actually, that is now the single most defensible thing we have. In the for sale vertical, our kind of sister vertical, which obviously we do not operate in, you have the MLS. And so actually, you could argue for sale would be an easier place to launch a business, because you can integrate the MLS, you could bring List Hub in and like build a platform that rivaled Zillow or Homes quicker. Whereas in rentals, as you guys know as well as I do, there's no real MLS. There's a few local ones in certain broker-heavy markets, but you basically kind of have to build an MLS bottom up, mainly for PMC and landlord inventory. And I think that creates an enormous barrier to entry that's probably one of the hardest two-sided marketplaces I can imagine kind of entering. Obviously, I had no idea how hard it would be when we started, but now we're kind of 10 years in. I'm delighted we're there, because I think the moat to your question is quite big.
Cool.
I disagree with him.
Really?
Yeah,
I want to hear it.
I have several challenges on that. I don't know if I should, jump in right now.
Sure.
So I'll start with a question, but obviously you probably have an idea of my stance, I guess, or position. But how much equity do you think you really have with a renter, I guess, as an ILS, meaning the maturity? So 10 years in, 20 years in versus 3 years in. It seems to me that while, yes, you want and are hoping to, I guess, gain some loyalty with a renter over the course of 5 to 10 years, while they're still on that track, maybe for some longer, 10, 15, that for the most part, that's not reality. Like, meaning if I were to search for an apartment and I happen to use Zumper, or I happen to use one of the competitors, and then a year or two, let's say I re-upped and stayed in that community for 2 years and then went back searching for another apartment, the likelihood of me using Zumper again because I did that 2 years ago is pretty remote, right? So I'm just starting over. Therefore, the cost of entry, I agree with all the value you say that you acquire over 10 years, meaning from the data, um, perhaps the following, that's one of the ones that I'm questioning a little bit more. But I just see it as, for the most part, when people are going through that process, they start over each time, and there isn't much loyalty, to a specific ILS. Therefore, wouldn't that mean that it actually isn't that big of an entry, other than capital? And I'm not dismissing that, but that if you have the money, that you could come in quickly. And part two of that is where we're going to be talking more today with you, is the generative AI. So one of the things that I think could accelerate an ILS, a new ILS, would be the ability to build and scale content at a speed you couldn't even imagine, right? Just a few years ago. And so therefore I could stand up a new ILS with some pretty amazing content, potentially using modern technology, and put in a ton of capital, mostly to, let's say, search results and marketing, and find myself competing, in fact, like a lot faster than what it would have taken, 10 years ago. So that's my challenge slash, and there was one or two questions in there.
Yeah. No, so a couple of thoughts. Great challenge. First of all, you're right. Let me start there. Renters are this is an infrequent purchase. So not only is it hard to buy the supply side, to build the supply side in our market, this is also, as you said, an infrequent purchase. The median renter changes every 18 to 36 months. So you're right. Like, a lot changes in like 1.5 to 3 years. And so there isn't really like brand loyalty. Now, there's a slight caveat to that obviously, as Zumper has now, where we have tens of millions of renters in our system, our machine learning algorithms get very good at predicting where renters may be moving again. And so we're actually quite good at re-engaging renters that came to us 2 years ago when we could have signals that they may be about to move again. So there's a slight asterisk to that, where there is some way to build the loop, but fundamentally correct. Now, a couple of points on that. One is we see that as an opportunity where, as the youngest ILS, that's an opportunity for us to build share, where they're kind of, just because they used ILS ABC 2 years ago doesn't mean they'll use them today. And then I think the most interesting point, Reed, you said is around Gen AI, and like, couldn't you just raise money, spin up like a kind of semantic search engine on Gen AI that builds this entirely different experience to an ILS? So 100% on the front end. And by the way, as we're going to discuss later, I think for the incumbents like us and our 3 or 4 biggest competitors, we all have to think about how you're going to change the UX to compete with that. But I think the one kind of bit I don't agree with, and I know this painfully, is if you just spun up a ChatGPT looking kind of search engine for apartments, how do you feed it with supply? Because this isn't like Amazon, where Amazon, if it has 40%, 50% of TVs, my wife and I will be like, yeah, you know what? It's a TV. We might spend $400 on it, but I don't need to see everything. The bar for this purchase, as you guys know, is so high. You're going to spend $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 on this lease. Renters, they've shown us from day one, they want to see the most inventory. And I think the biggest moat that the incumbents have over anyone new, there'll definitely be new entrants for sure. But the biggest moat we have is we have 10 plus years of real-time listing inventory that is painstakingly built, not just through the PMSs, not just through direct feeds, not just through MLSs, but also through posting tools that small landlords post directly into our interface that took years to build. And I think ultimately that is the biggest barrier to entry. I think a newbie who spins up a beautiful looking Gen AI tool will have is, how do they get access to that real-time inventory, and how do they get the kind of wider corpus of listings?
How many people are more from like, dynamic feeds, for example, versus like how many of the listings are like someone self-publishing?
Yeah, we have, we kind of see the market as like overall like 50% long tail. And by the way, long-term residential rentals, as you guys know, like 45, 50 million residential rental units in the US. We kind of look at them as like units under management, and about 50% of them are on the tail, 20 units or less under management. About 30% are in the torso, kind of local brokers or property managers or landlords. 25% is in the enterprise, kind of multi-state kind of REITs and PMCs. Our inventory breakdown corresponds somewhat according to that. So we'll get the kind of enterprise stuff via the Yardies and the Real Pages. We'll get the torso stuff either through the Appfolios or Buildiums, or through hundreds of direct XML feeds that we Zumper set up, which again was an enormous pain, but like so valuable now. And then the longer tail stuff will either get through kind of smaller feeds, like smaller PMS feeds, or through Zumper Manage, which is our own like posting tool where we get stuff that just doesn't end up on any other marketplace. So mostly feeds, but some of the best stuff you'll find on Zumper that you can't find elsewhere comes directly into our product, where we kind of keep it as a walled garden and no one else gets the listing.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And what I love about your response before Reed's question, and then even after, is I was just talking. I was at a conference last week, and I was talking to another founder, and he was discounting so much of what he had done over the last 6 years. And he's like, "Oh, it would be so easy if only I knew this other thing first. Like, that was more valuable." And I was like, "It's actually the reverse." Or like most founders discount all the effort that they've put in and the moat they've built, and it's almost like this what's it called, not abundance mindset, but it's almost the reverse, like where they're more like trying to protect their little molehill of whatever, as opposed to seeing like, man, look how far they've come and how much effort they've put in, and they almost forget what they didn't know before and what they do know now. So I just love that you're at least giving yourself some credit there.
No, I love that, David. And there's a funny meme on the internet that I've sent my team a couple of times. You guys have probably sent it around internally at least once. There's a funny meme of some like kind of banner at like a sports event or something, or a company, and it says, "We didn't do this because it was easy. We did it because we thought it would be easy." And I think like building like a two-sided marketplace is like the perfect thing, where like when I built Zumper, studying at grad school, I thought I was like, okay, whatever. You get some listings, you build the supply side out, but like, oh, the hard thing must be building the consumer brand and the consumer experience. And like, that's really freaking hard to build the consumer brand and the consumer experience, but it's 10% as hard as building the supply side. And I've definitely been pitched in the last couple of years a bunch of startups who are like, oh, we're going to like take over rentals and beat Zillow and Zumper. And it's like, I sadly know this from experience that, oh my goodness, of course, I lose sleep at night of any kind of competitors and new entrants. Like, it's not to dismiss them, but it is hard. And the supply side is painfully hard. Even just to be specific, if you go to like the big PMCs and the REITs and you say, hey, I'm building an ILS and I'll show your listings for free, which, by the way, is how lots of ILSs started, including Zumper. We were offering everything for free to begin as we built the marketplace. A bunch of them will say no. Like, it's a pain in the ass for them to manage another feed, make sure the data's accurate. They don't want to get in trouble because an ILS that's brand new and doesn't know what they're doing misrepresents a price, and then a renter comes in and like says, well, you owe it to me because ABC says it's. And so actually you can't even get the listings for free in many cases. And that is like a crazy hurdle that like all of us have to kind of overcome to get to scale. So 1,000% there'll be entrants. I can't wait to see kind of how they approach it. But I think that having the listing moat is a good start for the incumbents. And it kind of takes me onto like a wider thing, I believe. And I may be right about this and I may be wrong. But I kind of think about like Web 2.0 when like the Zillows of the world rode SEO. That was like a whole new entrant where Zillow built an entire business at the expense of like newspapers and classifieds, where Zillow just built a far more modern brand in the for sale world and just dominated on SEO. So you had like the incumbents, aka the back pages of the newspapers, decimated, and these new online players just win. I think as we go from like Web 2.0 to 3.0, which is like the Gen AI kind of shift and the quantum leap where in computing that we're undergoing, there's many marketplaces where I think it actually entrenches the incumbents, which is very different to what happened in 1.0 to 2.0. In 2 to 3.0, actually, if the incumbents believe in Gen AI and build phenomenal user experiences, well, then they've built the disruptive front end and they have the like painstakingly built back end. And I actually think you start a little bit ahead in the race if you can get it right. So I don't know if that will play out quite like that in every industry, but I think in marketplaces where supply is very hard to aggregate, actually, this one gives you an advantage if you're an incumbent, as long as you see it coming.
Is it more the relationships then you're saying that it's so difficult to build that supply side, or is it the piping? And if it is, I'm sure it's both, but it sounds like you're saying it's more just getting the initial, I guess, agreements in place, buy-ins coming in new, as you said, there might be some concerns or risks that they might see, or just the complexity of having, as you said, to deal with another feed. But I just wanted to ask you directly, when you think about building supply side, what's the most difficult part today versus maybe what it was, 12 years ago?
Great question. It's always been the relationships, not the technical side. Although I will say, let me start with the technical side, and it's a fantastic question, that there are now standardized formats that we all know and kind of get used to in terms of ingesting. Like every time we bring a new feed on, it's either an existing PMS, like a RealPage or a Yardi that we already work with, so someone just switches it on, or it comes in like a standard MITS format or Trulia XML format. So they're kind of like these standards in our industry now, some of which we've helped to build, but honestly, most of which, if I'm being candid, we benefited from as a later entrant. In the early days, those things didn't exist. There was really like basic feed infrastructure. The PMSs weren't as dominant as they are now. And so a lot of these like were, to go back to 2012, 2014, Trulia, who obviously now are part of Zillow, they created this like Trulia XML format that for many like longer tail listings was like the default way to send listings to all the MLSs. And I think Zumper still ingests XML feeds called the Trulia XML feed because they set such a standard and they really like help the rest of us kind of build on top of it. On the harder side of the coin, it's the relationships. I'll give like 2 examples. When we launched in 2012, we went out and like tried to get the top 100 PMCs and REITs to advertise on Zumper. We offered them for free, like free advertising, help us build liquidity. We were just in a few markets and we got 2 out of 100 to say yes for free. We said, we'll do all the work. We said, we'll integrate your listings. 2 of them came on board before we launched. 98 said no or didn't respond to free advertising. So as a testament to how hard the relationship is, it's really, really hard to build rapport. And then the second testament here is, so Zumper is now pretty big. We are nowhere near as big as an apartments.com or a Zillow, but we're pretty big. And we have tens of millions of users. I think in peak 2021, which was like peak rental demand. I think we had over 60 million users in 1 year in the US and Canada. And so we're like one of the 2 or 3 ILSs that PMCs will buy, in many cases. I think PMCs typically will choose between the 4 or 5 of us, and they'll bring on 2 or 3. And now Zumper is one of the consideration. Saying that, we have some REITs that use us 100%, and we have some major PMCs that might have us on 2% of their portfolio. And we're over 10 years old. And so as a testament to how long it takes to build the trust in our industry and to really kind of show value, then grow it, some of them we're still celebrating that we're at 2%, because we go in at 2%, show what we can do, the high ROI, and then grow to 4, then to 8, then to 12. But 10 years in, whereas we have some people at 100% of their portfolio, we have some PMCs at like under 5%, and we're still fighting to show our value. And that's totally fair, all part of the game. It's a very old industry that has long built relationships with the ILSs that came before us. And it's the job of the kind of newbies to break through that and show why we're different. But it's hard.
And I can already tell I'm not going to satisfy all my curiosity with you, because I want to learn more about the history, but I also want to hear about what's next. So I love how you broke down one of your just a few minutes ago, kind of like past phase, current phase, future phase. So why don't you do that for us for the ILS industry? Like, where was it kind of like before you guys started, and why you wanted to start? What is it? What has it become today? And then what's it look like the next decade?
Great. Yeah, no, I've never actually thought about this, so I'm going to answer on the fly. Okay,
Okay.
so 3 segments. I'd say the kind of phase 1 was a bit like the Wild West of like classifieds. So there was like, classified sites, local classified sites. There's like a couple in LA, a couple in New York. There was obviously Craigslist across the US. In Canada, there was Kijiji. And you basically, it was the Wild West because it was kind of like, it was really kind of like line items of listings. It wasn't like map list search. These were typically literally lists, and kind of, it was kind of like the Web 2.0 figuring out exactly what the user experience is going to be. Then I think you have stage 2, which was the professionalization of that trend. So it was still Web 2.0, but this was when like the heavy hitters like the Zillows of the world launched rentals, or where CoStar bought apartments.com and invested heavily in professionalizing and building it out. And then when you had the startups launched to try and take on the incumbents with a fresh look, and then the 2 that got to scale, one is Zumper and one is our friends at Apartment List, who actually, both of us kind of, they're a bit older than us, but both companies kind of launched a bit later on, but could have made it into the consideration set. And so that was kind of stage 2, but it's still fundamentally Web 2.0, meaning, read, write, websites that you can interact with, send messages across, there's clearly like more beautiful UIs, phenomenal photography, Matterports, like all these other things that we've integrated, but they're still fundamentally Web 2.0. So now we are at the top of the first inning, before maybe the first pitch of Web 3.0. And again, when I say Web 3.0, I don't mean crypto, which is kind of what Web 3 is meant for the last few years. I really mean kind of like Web 3.0, which is moving from Web 2.0 into kind of agents and getting stuff done and having kind of like an assistant actually do the work for you. That's basically AI. And in that world, I think it's wide open. And to use another sporting metaphor, we at Zumper are trying to skate to where the puck is going, but we have theories about where the puck is going, but like there is no concrete data or evidence to know exactly what's about to happen in this shift to Web 3.0. And so to summarize more succinctly what you asked, I'd say part 1 was the classifieds before Zumper came along. Part 2 is, as Zumper noticed the opportunity to professionalize the classifieds and build a much more immersive user experience, a bunch of other players noticed the same thing, and it's ended up being 4 or 5 winners in that space. And now those 4 or 5 winners are trying to reinvent themselves into this third wave. And who I have theories I'm sure we're going to get into, and I know you guys have a lot of work being done here too, but I think it's wide open about what 3.0 actually means and how to best leverage it to deliver phenomenal experiences, both for renters, but also the PMCs.
Well, just to check in on you, I guess maybe emotionally, but as a founder, how does it strike you? Does that strike you, meaning as you said, top of before the first pitch in the next inning or whatever, is that exciting, or is that more like, oh shoot, you clawed your way to be one of one of the normal consideration set, as you said, and then like as you get there, now all of a sudden like the game changes. So I'm just curious, like how does that excite you, or does it more like almost make you nervous?
I always tell my team at the beginning, after the holiday season, when we all come back on the first week of January, I have this rule with my team that I'm always like, Zumper has to feel like a new startup every January the 1st or January the 2nd, whenever we come back, or we're doing something wrong. It has to feel fresh. It has to be new. We cannot just be turning the wheel. There has to be a new kind of like goal or a new kind of thing that excites us. And like, this one is the mothership of something new and exciting that like gets us going. This is a true computing shift, and I think it's more exciting than mobile. I remember when like iOS and Android came out, we leveraged it. We worked with Apple, we worked with Google, we were editor's choice on Android, we were like featured on the App Store, and like we did the whole thing. We continued to build really great native native mobile applications. But I think this one is even more exciting. And so, to your point about, is it like another thing you have to look out for, or shit, is this something like really good? I think it's the latter camp. And the final thing I'll say there, just again from a place of pure candor, is we are not the number one rental ILS. There are, ILSs like a decade plus older than us that perform better on SEO, spend a lot more money than us on SEM, and so whereas we're delighted with where we're positioned as a company, and I think we've done an amazing job kind of catching up with everyone as a much smaller company to be considered next to them, we haven't won yet. And so what's really interesting from that position is I think Web 3.0 gives you the opportunity to think about shortcuts. And if you make the right bet and you skate to where the puck is going and you're right, even though in the early days you're embarrassed by where you skated because there's no one there and there's no data to validate your decision, if you get it right and the market catches up with you, I think it's this one-off opportunity to like leapfrog and all in. That's the game we got to be playing.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, as David was framing that kind of past, present, future, or these chapters within the ILSs, clearly in the middle was consolidation, right? Tons of consolidation. So there was like proliferation, like now there's like 100 of these things, and then they started gobbling each other up. And that was, I think.
Are you still going to keep the teenager analogy, or is this?
I'm moving on from the teenager analogy, but I think that was fairly predictable, and you see that in other industries as well, where this has happened. But my question, and I asked this, I don't know, last year, different supplier, you may know, God, from Aptly, Sina. You know Sina from Aptly, CEO. I'm curious how you would answer this, but is consolidation is that good within the ILSs? And I don't know if you can do this, Anth. Actually, I'm sure you can. I would love to hear 3 points of view here. One, yours as the supplier. So, and then also tell me if you think that Gen AI hitting is better for the consumer and then the property manager. So give me all 3 POVs as far as this consolidation and Gen AI, but maybe that's too much to ask. Maybe I should just stick with the consolidation.
All right, so we'll start there. No, so love it. Let's start on the consolidation. So you nailed, and Reed, I think the best comparison is travel. If you look at like the travel industry and like the OTAs, as like kind of industry folks would say, you have all these brands, but they're basically consolidated underneath like Booking Group and Expedia Group. And then you kind of have like Airbnb and Hopper and a couple of other guys off to the side. But like the illusion of choice is real. You think you can look on like 10 OTAs, kind of they're owned by 2 people. Just like you go to the cereal aisle and you're like, wow, my kids, there's so many cereals for you to pick. Because like, no. They're made by 2 or 3 companies. Illusion of choice. Somewhat happening in rentals, as you said. I think, CoStar, Zillow, RentPath, now Redfin, consolidated so many kind of ILSs. And then you have Zumper and Apartment List who did mini consolidations. We bought PadMapper. I think our private competitors bought a couple of other smaller things as well. But Yeah, it's kind of consolidated down to like 4 or 5 major players. You also have like Realtor kind of doing their thing as well. So back to your question of like kind of good for the consumer or the PMC. I think the PMC, even though the PMCs will always say we like choice, we want competitive pricing, I think it probably is helpful for the PMC not to take 12 phone calls with 12 ILSs, but be able to like consolidate down to 4 or 5 conversations. It is not kind of like just one that they have to deal with. And so I think there's a lot of choice and they're able to like optimize on cost. I'd say for the consumer, it's different. If I'm honest, like, a lot of the ILSs who are under an umbrella are just like the OTAs where they're showing the exact same inventory. It may be in a slightly different sort order, but it's kind of the same back end that then powers the front end sites. And so if I'm a consumer, probably like seeing less innovation because you're kind of seeing only 4 or 5 companies inventory versus before you had 12 where you may have had someone that was stronger in LA and someone who was stronger in like Michigan. So probably less choice as a consumer, but the one kind of asterisk to that is I think all of us have become so good at ingesting inventory that like we all have most of it now. Everyone is slightly stronger somewhere. So I guess before we go into Gen AI, I'd say a consolidation was natural. There's kind of 5 major players, I think, now kind of in the space. And I think for PMCs, it's good. They get good value and they're able to kind of trade off between all of us. And we know that from prospective clients and we know that from existing clients when they renegotiate their kind of annual spend.
Yeah, well, that's great. I appreciate that. I'm glad you were tracking. And I don't know if we should go ahead and use this as the springboard or catalyst to get into the Gen AI, but I was going to ask the same question. You were kind of touching on the surface of that. But as far as the user experience, how beneficial is kind of continuity, I guess, between, because that's what I see right now. If you go to, and I don't think you'll take this defensively in any way, because I'm applying this to all ILSs, but they all essentially, for me, have the same experience. There's some variation, but not much. Meaning, once I get there, I am going to see my listings, my images, my videos. Start filtering. It's a very similar experience, versus what you're saying we might be on the cusp of. I mean, maybe we already are starting to see some of the changes. At Digible, we talk all the time about the customer journey and how it's shifted, but in many ways has stayed the same over the years. It's just about like, where is more of that traffic coming from? But with generative AI, it seems like this, as you were saying at the front end, is one of the biggest changes. As Dave was saying, what are you excited about? Or is this exciting versus frustrating that, we're going to see, for many years? Is that good? Do you think that's going to be for the consumer, to now have Chat GPT, for example? I could go there, I could go to social, I could go direct to your website. I can get a lot of information from a Google business profile, or I can go to these directories. I mean, there's all these different places, and I'm wondering if you believe that's good for the consumer, or if you think more kind of consistency and continuity, within that user journey is actually better. And the reason I'm teeing this up is I'm wondering if within a few years you're going to see that paradigm shift, like fundamental big shift, where it's like you were experiencing it this way when you would search for now we've all moved over here in just in a few years, but we're all over here. Instead of like, there's kind of these legacy UIs for searching for apartments.
I think there's 2 obvious like things I've seen in Gen AI so far benefit renters, and I know Digible is aware of these because I think you guys are, in fact, I know you guys are working on these as well. So I'm actually curious to hear you guys answer it too. The 2 things I've seen, actually, I'll back up. What do I know about Gen AI? So I'm trying to learn, like every other entrepreneur out there, how to leverage this, not just as kind of a sexy PR launch, but as a meaningful improvement of the user experience, both for PMCs and for renters. So my experience in it so far has been, we built a very early plugin, the Zumper plugin for ChatGPT, that evolved to become a GPT. And the GPT is like an app that's now you can discover on ChatGPT, and it's now free. It used to be behind a paywall, but now anyone can do it, kind of on the sub menu on ChatGPT. And Zumper built the first ever rental app. So I have some data that I can kind of inform my kind of comment on. So I think there's like 2 things in the immediate term where renters can really benefit from Gen AI that isn't just sexy narratives, but no reality. This is like reality. So the first is like semantic search. So I think to your point, and no offense taken, Reed, like, yes, I think ILSs have very similar overlap on filters and kind of like ways to search. I think Gen AI offers renters the ability to really like curate the search beyond the 60-70% of searches that are the same, like pet friendly, one bedroom under $3,000. Like they're easy to do on an ILS. The example I love to use with our clients as Zumper is like using Zumper's GPT on ChatGPT, but again, this is just using the LLM, so technically anyone else can build this experience too, which is like, hey Zumper, I want to live in Santa Monica under 2,500 a month. Again, that isn't unique, but then it gets unique by saying, hey, I have a dog that weighs 50 pounds. Can you read the reviews of the buildings there that allow 50-pound dogs? By the way, I'm a Whole Foods addict, so I want to live within 2-minute walk of a Whole Foods. Oh, and by the way, I'm a member of Barry's boot camp, and I go to Barry's every kind of 4 days, or I go twice a week, and I need to be within 10 minutes of a Barry's. Now, those queries you can't do on Zumper or on ILS because they're so idiosyncratic to the renter. Whereas on ChatGPT 4.0, using Zumper's GPT, the way the technology works, as you guys know, is they can use the LLM and publicly available data to match to Zumper's API in our database. And so they combine querying our database to find relevant listings with marrying it to where are the Whole Foods in Santa Monica? Where's the Barry's Bootcamp in Santa Monica? That reply, which is really good and is accurate in ChatGPT, is phenomenal. And so for, I guess, long tail queries where you want a really specific query, Gen AI has done something that no ILS or many other marketplaces has ever been able to do with just filters or even semantic search in the kind of search box. This is just an order of magnitude better. The second thing I think Gen AI will do is action. So we kind of talked about like, Web 2 was read write. I think Web 3.0 will be kind of read write do, like take actions on my behalf, like these agents, so to speak. And so we haven't launched this yet, so I can't speak about data. I can speak about data about the first thing of long tail queries. In the fall, Zumper's going to launch something really exciting, which is kind of an on Zumper assistant, which actually takes actions for you. So if you think about, and again, I know Digible have enormous kind of experience here, and you think about this a lot, but you think about renters submitting the same lead forms, the same queries, the same questions. Like there is a more efficient way to do that also for the PMCs better pre-qualifies renters on RILS, or to your point, on Google Business Profile, or kind of other surface areas that I know you guys have thought a lot about. And we don't want to just be a Q&A service. I think like all of us, we want to move into being an agent and taking actions for the renter. So instead of her having to like send the same message 12 times, there has to be a more intelligent way of doing that. There has to be a more intelligent way of like planning her route around open houses on the weekends. So anyway, I think there's two obvious use cases: far better Q&A and more curated search, and then an agent model set on top of that to take actions on your behalf and take smart actions, are two obvious ways where I think Gen AI right now, with the current capabilities of LLMs before ChatGPT 5, before the next Anthropic model, you can do both of those things now. One of them we've launched, the other one we're launching later this year, and I think it's like a really exciting time. The only caveat I will add to all of this is none of this has become a major channel for Zumper yet, in terms of this is not like 50% of our traffic yet. So to marry it to my earlier comment of like skating to where the puck is going, these are like experimental bets we're making that we're prepared to double down on. But SEO has not gone away. Google Business Profile has not gone away. Like people are still today, for the vast majority of their searches, doing it the traditional way. The question all of us have to answer is, in 24 months, will that statement still be true?
It's interesting because it's not that unlike what you're describing as a company. Is kind of like how OpenAI got to ChatGPT, right? Like they built their model and then they're like, hey, here's one small use case, and then that's what caught fire, but they had no idea
Totally.
and so it's kind of like as an organization, if you want to be the ones like on the forefront, or maybe as you said, could leapfrog people, you have to be willing to make those bets, and you just have to be okay that 90% of them are just not going to go anywhere.
I think this is the classic innovator's dilemma, isn't it?
I think it's innovator's dilemma. I thought that's where he was going to go earlier when he was talking about the legacy marketplaces and why they couldn't be as nimble.
Yeah.
Because like if you're apartments.com, like the risk of revenue.
Totally. That's what I definitely want to save room for, get into, get Anth's thoughts on that. I agree with everything you said. I loved your two very specific use cases. But I'll say in isolation, those are benefits to the consumer. But then there is the consequence, I guess, in some ways of that, where it's like, now I'm not sure where to search, or I have another place that I need to like do research, which I think it's amazing, like what you can get out of that, but it's also pull that all the way through. It's like, well, now I'm over here getting these really in-depth answers and all that, and now I've got to keep this other browser open so that I can go back to Zumper or go back to search, or it's just one more stop, I guess, is what I'm saying. And so that's why I'm assuming that it won't last that long, where you have the split. I think eventually we're going to see all searches, and I don't know what that looks like either, Anth, but it will be more gen AI, I guess fueled, or that will be a huge part of the experience, versus like right now, this is just a really cool thing that I can also add into my research or add into my journey.
Yeah, question for you guys actually. Do you guys think there'll be a one browser moment? So like, but part of Gen AI and like the consumer journey that people are speculating, and obviously we think about all the time, is it possible that in 2 years, most people, or even like 40% of millennials or Gen Zs, which would be a staggering change, will just operate in one browser window? They will be able to, maybe have multiple sub tabs in Anthropic or Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini, but basically they'll conduct their entire work life, personal life, travel, rental searches, all in this basically one tab of effectively a more advanced version of ChatGPT. And if so, as a consumer marketplace, what is our value? And it kind of goes back to the supply side, which is our value then is the piping and bringing real-time data in that like other people don't have. My personal view is that will increase, although it's not going to happen overnight. But I think any consumer-facing brand has to think about what is their role if consumers actually do move to a one tab, one browser world. How do you perform in that? Is that a positive? Is that a negative? Is it like zero sum? Curious what you guys think. Do you think in like 24 months, a significantly higher percentage of consumers might just live, to your point, Reed, in like a one browser page and they do everything in their life from that?
No, I think it's going to take a lot longer than that, especially in this industry. And I speak more for, I'll say, the suppliers and the property management companies and the big PMSs. I don't think that they'll kind of come together in a way that will accelerate that, like inside of 24 months, even 36. I wish. I think it's an amazing kind of thing to imagine, and I do see it going that way, but I think it's going to take more time than that.
I agree. I think it's going to take longer. I also think Reed and I have talked about this before, but I don't think. What I'm curious, Anth, how I played with your guys' extension in ChatGPT, and it was super fun. I found like I treated it like I was when I was relocating from New York to Colorado, and how I wasn't even settled on Colorado, and I was looking at citydata.com and all these different places, and I was surprised. I was like, "Is this a waste that I'm going to try this approach? Like, I don't know where I want to move, but I want to spend time in this kind of area." And it worked amazingly well. It brought up all these like little locales that I had no familiarity with, that I'm like, shoot, this could really be something for me. But to the one browser tab, I think there's two things here. One, consumers have to be willing to make the leap, but also the suppliers, to Reed's point, have to be willing to let that leap happen. I think about like when Reed and I were still at the Post, we were getting RFPs that are like, fill out this Excel file, and it's like there's got to be a better way to do like an RFP versus like a line item Excels. And a lot of industries are like that, where you will have all the big agencies that just resist moving onto a platform, and they're like, this is how we do it. So you guys as the ILSs in some ways can drive this. If you guys all stood strong and said, nope, everyone's going to come to our portal, then it's going to prevent people from using one browser tab. But also then if you have someone that's willing to jump out of line and figure it out and how to monetize it, then that could help speed up the adoption. I still think 24 months is quick though. So I guess I'm curious to jump to the business model. Like how
That's exactly where I was going to go.
Okay, good.
I'm glad you asked it. Yeah. I think that's the other thing that complicates
Yeah.
this and could slow it down, is people don't know how to make money potentially on this new, like, whatever this is. I mean, we haven't defined it exactly, but sorry, David, go ahead.
I just want to know, Anth, what you think. Like how might this business model change for your cohort in this new Web 3.0?
Yeah, the business model is interesting. Literally last week, the Perplexity, one of the Gen AI players, they announced last week they were going to launch ads within Perplexity for $50 CPM, which is like fascinating. Why was it CPM, not CPC? Why did they not copy the Google model? It was kind of like everyone's fumbling around like how to monetize this. So in our world, I mean, let's just take an extreme example, which I agree with you guys. I don't think it's going to happen. But let's just say in 10 years' time, all consumer marketplaces kind of just are replaced by one page, agents and AIs where people do spend their time in the browser. And again, I don't think this is going to happen. I think then the business model of the ILSs, the OTAs, the for sale kind of portals is almost then entirely the piping, which is like those AIs are unlikely to do the work of aggregating the thousands of data feeds and stuff that we've had to do to bring it in, because there's a bunch of manual work you have to do. You can't automate a bunch of that work. And then like it's funny, like in an extreme example, what used to be consumer facing brands would then become middleware, where you're kind of the layer between like the PMCs and REITs here. You make sure the kind of stuff is aggregated and brought to the LLMs, and then they manifest it. I think in the real world, I completely agree. And I think it was like a Gartner report that said something like, I think it was like a third of SEO, or maybe 25 to 30% of SEO will be cannibalized by Gen AI. I think it was in the next like 3 or 5 years. And it's like, I mean, who knows? But like, maybe that sounds like it's plausible. In that world, I think ILSs like us are in this middle ground where absolutely our end state is to still bring renters onto the ILS. But the way I would think about it is we're just farming for you where tomorrow's renter will be in a different way. Today we do a lot of content marketing. We work very hard to show well in SEO, and that's how we kind of farm where users are today and bring them into Zumper and show them kind of an amazing experience. I think in this world, you start to see Gen AI tools as places where tomorrow's renter will be looking, and how do you get Zumper's brand in front of them before you then bring them into Zumper and produce like an incredibly immersive experience. And I think that experience, if they're trained on ChatGPT to have like a Q&A service, that can't just look like the filter set that you guys pointed out just now is the same on all ILSs. Same filters, very similar listings. I think it's on all of us that when we go and farm kind of fish for users in other places and bring them into Zumper and say, hey, this is an actual rental specific platform. We can serve you better by coming here. It can't just be our map list. Clearly in the next 2 to 3 years, our service is going to have to be different, more conversational, and to our earlier point, much more about action and an agent taking action for you. And that is what we're currently building. And so in terms of monetization, to come back to your question, actually, I think it looks the same. Ultimately, Zumper charges PMCs and REITs above a certain kind of like level of listings for monthly access to our platform per property. And ultimately, we're doing exactly the same thing in terms of giving them exposure to where millennials and Gen Z renters are. It's just we're now finding those Gen Z and millennial renters in completely different places. And instead of just sending them a message from our platform, we're sending them a much wider kind of set of data around the renter who's contacting them, because we've been an agent to them instead of just a search engine. So probably the realistic answer is we're monetizing exactly the same way, but we're doing it in a much higher value kind of ads solution. And I think that would be kind of where Gen AI is, both in finding them in different places and then treating them very differently when they come onto the ILS.
So years ago, Google started doing the like single answer box, right? And they were taking content from like New York Times or whatever and surfacing the answer right in the search results, so you never had to click through. And there was a big uproar for a while there where it was like I forget what it was, but it was above 50% of searches were being 0-click searches. And I wonder if that's more going to be like exacerbated by this, a new way of doing things, whether it's the large language models or Perplexity or whatever. And in which case, if if that is true, it's almost like what Kayak started to do, as you were saying, for travel, where it's like, hey, you don't want to have to go to all these travel sites, so you just come to the one place. Is that not what like a Perplexity or like a ChatGPT or Gemini ends up becoming, where basically someone's like, I just have to be listed in one place. I don't need to be listed in 6 places. Or they even get so much better that they don't even need that. They're just like, Perplexity will find my website and surface me, so I don't have to pay anybody a fee. So I'm just wondering, Anth, like how you think about, I guess, that like the zero click sort of thing playing out even further with you versus the content providers that were up in arms about it.
Yeah, so first of all, the zero click thing is absolutely was a metric, you nailed it, at Google, that they literally optimized around, which is like try and give users the result without clicking deeper. And as someone who has a strong SEO kind of presence, oh my goodness, it pushed all the 10 blue links down. Like, so you knew it. Like when that came out and that increasingly took up the search result page, we were like, wow, that our positions haven't changed, but we're seeing like a 20% drop in SEO traffic. What's up? And it's like, well, actually, it pushed everyone down. So if you were like 7th before, you're still 7th, but you're like an extra scroll 7th, and that sucked. And yes, if I had to draw that out, my guess, and I have no intel on this, is Google's response to all this, which is obviously Gemini ultimately becomes that box, and they're already doing it through what used to be called SGEs, now called something else. But like Google will happily ultimately cannibalize its own business if it has to survive, and Google Search and Gemini will increasingly start to like overlap. In terms of like, how do we think about the kind of one browser thing? Does everything go into Perplexity? I think looking at history and like how things have gone, typically those like aggregators, which now in 3.0 is the LLMs, they've typically worked with the marketplaces, because in a marketplace they get a one and done, like you get all the listings. So for example, when Facebook Marketplace went into classifieds, they partnered with us and like one other player to basically just get all the listings sent to Facebook Marketplace. I think the LLMs know that their crawling will be slower than us feeding an API, and so are more likely to actually just work with a few ILSs. But coming back to, I think, David, you said this earlier and you nailed it, which is like, who's going to blink first? Because to begin with, all ILSs, all OTAs, why, originally you're like, why would I work with people that could disintermediate my business? But eventually it's like, well, actually, if the more innovative or disruptive ones, and aka the younger ones, are actually potentially prepared to do this, well, then that the game is up. And then like you get a small, kind of like a short to medium term advantage. The long term is incredibly unclear, but then the gates opens. An ILS is working with one of the LLMs. Then if another one comes on board, actually you'd probably have enough inventory to give comprehensive results. I don't know if that's about to happen, but us launching the first GPT on ChatGPT, again, the volume's interesting, but still very low for the moment. But it kind of signals Zumper's intent to help build this future, because we ultimately think it's better for both consumers and the PMCs. And so I think it's going to come pretty quickly in the next 2 years. And I think it will come more through partnerships where they get access to one and dones to these LLMs just combing the internet, because I think they'll always have slightly stale information and they'd rather get it from a real-time API.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, Reed, I know we're close to time on Anth. What, you want to get one more in?
Yeah, sorry, I got like 20 questions here. This one is not the one I was expecting to ask, but I have to. With an Elise, so and I don't know that you would or wouldn't consider them necessarily competition, but couldn't they be an interesting kind of disruptor here if they decided to actually build a marketplace? Because you said two of the things that are very difficult is the relationships and the piping. It seems to me they would have both. And what I'm waiting for, I guess, or surprised by, and maybe it's what I just don't know, is when I go to Zumper.com, why I'm not immediately greeted with the Chat GPT experience. And maybe they won't allow that yet. I don't know. But with Elise, it's like that's obviously their business model. Now they're going more end to end. But when will I mean, you've already spoken to it several times, but just what's preventing that? And with CoStar, if you could speak to two things. So would you think it's far-fetched for Elise to say we're no longer just serving properties, we're actually now going to directly like be a part of that search experience, that front end, or is that just you think too far reaching? And then the part two, more around CoStar Apartments.com, is how disruptive you think generative AI is going to be to their business model, or if you think they'll be able to hold on to that, because they're not even performance based. It doesn't seem like they're in a rush to get into this game from what I can tell, but again, you might have better intelligence than us and just be a little bit closer to it.
On the first question, I think Elise is amazing. Seen it work customers rave about it. We're integrated in various ways. So no, I wouldn't say they're a competitor. I think we're like kind of siblings in just trying to make the PMC experience better. But they may, like, I think especially on websites of PMCs, I've seen like kind of a lot of customers talk to us about like, could they just take over more of the website that a PMC has, that which is slightly different to building an ILS. And then, but I think the question also works the other way, which is like, where, as I mentioned earlier, we're building on platform kind of agents that will launch later this year, which will start to mirror a bit more like what you mentioned, Reed. And so also the question for us is, do we move more towards a lease where we're never going to build exactly what they've built? They're phenomenal. We wouldn't kind of try and disrupt that. But we also have had customers saying, well, if you're building an on-platform agent for Zumper that is very, very good at like understanding MAUs and converting them into tours, well, actually, can I use that as an extension on my website? So it's kind of competitive, but honestly, like accidentally, like our job is not to build a better Elise or better versions of Digible. Our job is to kind of bring people to the ILS and build an amazing experience. So I actually think it might be a question both ways. And then in terms of your other question of like the incumbents and the big players in the space and how they'll react, I honestly don't know. You should get them on the pod. I love your pod. You should talk to them and ask them, and I will listen avidly. I would say, all I would say is, because I can only speak for Zumper, is it's probably more likely the startups who have more to gain and less to lose, because they're kind of catching up and kind of getting into the game, are going to be the earlier ones to risk stuff. It probably, if you're later stage, like there's more to lose. Saying that, like if I used Zillow as an example, like Zillow are very disruptive, and even though they're a public company, they're very innovative. They're phenomenal at like cutting edge tech. I think their previous CEO, Rich Barton, talked a lot about how they're going to use AI. So actually, we'll see, because I don't think this is going to be an innovator's dilemma thing. I think everyone knows what's coming. I don't think it's that the big guys are going to not see this shift. It's more, can the big guys move fast enough or kind of see the right shift in where it's going, versus the startups who maybe are scrappy and might try 10 different ideas before one sticks. So the TLDR is I have no idea, but the next 24 months are going to be super interesting. And I think we'll know a lot more by, say, this time next year.
Well, Reed, do you have Jeff Goldblum's number so we can get him on?
Well, that I actually have that as one of my questions. Not what is his number, or can I get him on, but what's the character's name?
I don't know.
Brad Bellflower.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I figured you might know it. But when does he turn into this AI agent? I guess it just seems like such an obvious, like, okay, generative AI is out. You've seen him. And I would say part two of that I'm curious about, since we got to Goldblum, is why are they the only ones that are spending in traditional, and I'm exaggerating this a little bit, but they're on TV, they're on the radio, they're everywhere, as well as search. So and is it strictly like they have the money and most people, like, so therefore they're so far in front of it that we can't compete? But it just strikes me, I see Zillow, from time to time advertising in traditional media, getting the word out on, for sale. But what I don't see is all the other ILSs. It just doesn't seem like anybody else has bought into that. But it's hard to argue with their success, right? So
yeah, I'd be bought into it more if I had the balance sheet to be more aggressive. So
okay, so it's more just capital. Okay,
and then it's partly capital, and it's partly, I think we have always found really good roots in content marketing, SEO, a bunch of social stuff we do that's been really successful for the demographic we go after. But yes, they are the absolute kings of brand marketing in our space.
Well, Anth, we've already kept you long. I feel bad about that. But so if people want to learn more about what you guys are doing or what's to come, what's the best way for them to follow?
I'm on LinkedIn, Anthemos. There's only one of me, or at Anthemos, or at Zumper on Twitter, or X, whatever it's called now. The best ways, and we tweet about rental data. Obviously, love you guys at Digible, and try and share as much about the market as we go.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Anth.